She was just another gold digger in first class. At least that's what Nathan Kessler thought until he discovered who she really was. The first-class cabin reeked of leather and wealth, the air buzzing with soft conversations and the occasional clink of champagne glasses. Overhead bins snapped shut as passengers settled in, adjusting their designer bags and expensive watches. Nathan barely looked up from his phone as he slid into seat 3A, a window seat just the way he liked it. His confidence was palpable, the kind that came from years of closing deals and ruling boardrooms. He was the type of man who belonged in first class, a fact he subtly declared by loosening his tie and ordering a scotch before takeoff. The flight from Dallas to Tampa was just under 3 hours. Not long, but long enough for him to enjoy the luxuries of flying first class. He had no intention of working. There were drinks to enjoy and passengers to size up. That's when he saw her. A blonde woman seated a few rows ahead, her profile partially visible as she scrolled through her iPad. There was something about her, familiar, but he couldn't place it. Maybe she was a local news anchor, a C-list actress clinging to her fading fame. With a smirk, Nathan nudged the man sitting next to him, a mild-mannered traveler who'd unwittingly become Nathan's audience for the next few hours. Ever notice how some people think money can buy class? Nathan mused loudly, just enough for nearby passengers to hear. The man beside him gave a polite chuckle, keeping his focus on the in-flight magazine. He wasn't interested in conversation, but Nathan didn't need an audience to keep talking. She looks familiar, he continued, tilting his head. Probably some reality TV reject, you know the type. Big hair, expensive handbag, no idea how to blend in. His words floated through the cabin, catching the attention of a few nearby passengers, but the blonde woman remained absorbed in her iPad, seemingly unaware or uninterested in Nathan's commentary. That didn't sit well with him. People like her were supposed to care what men like him thought. As the plane began taxiing, the flight attendant made her rounds, checking seat belts and collecting empty glasses. Nathan leaned back, stretching slightly, already bored before the flight had even begun. He noticed the woman again. She handed off her drink to the attendant, with a smile, her posture composed and her demeanor calm. It irritated him. There was a quiet confidence about her, an ease that suggested she wasn't the type of woman who would be rattled by snide remarks or side glances. That only made Nathan want to dig deeper. He leaned forward, ensuring his voice carried just enough. She must have married well, he mused, shaking his head as though it was all a joke. Third husband, maybe fourth. Plastic surgeons on speed dial. It's always the same. This time there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. The businessman across the aisle shot Nathan a brief but pointed look. The flight attendant hesitated ever so slightly as she moved past. Even the man beside Nathan exhaled quietly, as though wishing himself anywhere else. But Nathan, of course, didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care. He reached for another scotch as the plane lifted off, tapping his fingers on the glass. 3 hours, plenty of time for entertainment. But what he didn't realize was that his entertainment was about to come at his own expense. Barely past cruising altitude, Nathan resumed his commentary, determined not to let the slight of being ignored go. The woman, whoever she was, hadn't so much as glanced at him, showing no sign that she had heard or cared about his words. That didn't sit right with him. So, he leaned in. The moment the seatbelt sign blinked off, he flagged down the flight attendant with an exaggerated wave as if he were at a bar. "Another scotch," he said, handing over his empty glass. "And whatever she's having too. On me." It was a test, a way to provoke a reaction. Maybe she'd laugh, maybe shake her head, indulge him in a little harmless back and forth. Women like her, he assumed, loved attention, but the flight attendant didn't so much as blink. "She's fine, sir," she said smoothly, taking his glass and moving away before he could press further. Nathan chuckled to himself, shaking his head. So, she was one of those, the kind of woman who carried herself like she was above everyone else. Too good for small talk. He turned back to his reluctant seatmate, completely unaware that his encounter with her was about to take an unexpected turn. He had opened a book, clearly trying to avoid conversation. "You ever notice that Nathan said?" He tapped the armrest between them, looking sideways. "Some people walk around like they're the main character in life, like the rest of us are, just extras in their little movie." The man gave him a quick glance, then returned to his book. "Haven't really thought about it." Nathan grinned. He wasn't going to let this go. "I'll tell you exactly who she is," he continued, keeping his voice at just the right volume, loud enough to be heard but not so loud that he'd come off as rude. "She's the kind of woman who gets by on her last name. You know, one of those women who trades on favors. Maybe a senator's ex-wife, or some lawyer who loves the camera but couldn't win a case to save her life." He let the words hang in the air, waiting for a reaction, something that would let him know he was getting under her skin, but nothing. The blonde woman remained composed, scrolling through her tablet as though he wasn't even there. Nathan exhaled sharply through his nose, irritated. He adjusted his watch, the discomfort beginning to grow. This wasn't fun anymore. Not even a glance from her. "Guess she's too important for the rest of us," he muttered. A few rows back, a woman in a navy pantsuit exchanged a knowing look with her seatmate across the aisle. An older man glanced up from his newspaper, raising an eyebrow. People were starting to notice him now, but Nathan, in his arrogance, assumed they were on his side, that they found her just as ridiculous as he did. That belief made him double down. Leaning forward, he rested his elbow on the armrest, lowering his voice like he was about to share some great insight. "Mark my words," he said, smirking. "She's going to post something later about how exhausting travel is. Probably complain about manspreading or some nonsense. Women like her love playing the victim." He waited, but just as he was about to continue, a calm, firm voice interrupted him. "Excuse me, sir." Nathan turned, expecting the flight attendant, but instead he found himself face to face with the blonde woman. For the first time, she had turned fully toward him, her expression unreadable. There was no anger, no irritation, just a quiet, measured look that made Nathan suddenly aware of how loudly he'd been speaking. For the first time in a long while, he felt something uncomfortable, something foreign. He shook it off quickly, though, meeting her gaze, waiting for her to scold him, argue with him, anything that would make his behavior seem justified. But she didn't. She just studied him for a moment, then gave the faintest, most unreadable smile before turning back to her tablet, as if he wasn't worth her time. And for the first time, Nathan felt something he wasn't used to feeling. He shifted in his seat, adjusting his cufflink as if that could erase the discomfort creeping into his chest. That look she had given him, it wasn't dismissive or irritated. It was something worse. It was knowing. It was as if she had seen 100 men just like him before and had already decided he wasn't worth the effort. That should have made it easier to brush off, to roll his eyes and go back to his scotch, but it didn't. Instead, it gnawed at him. The flight attendant returned with his drink, setting it down with a polite nod before moving past him. Nathan noticed she didn't offer any lingering attention, no small talk, no warmth. Had she heard him too? He took a slow sip, letting the ice clink against the glass, then glanced at the woman again. Pam, he reminded himself. He still didn't know exactly who she was, but something about her name tickled at the back of his mind. She was still reading, still unbothered, but now that she had acknowledged him once, there was an invisible line drawn between them, a silent dare. Nathan didn't do well with dares. So, he leaned in slightly, pitching his voice low enough to seem casual, but loud enough that those around them could catch bits of it. "Pam, is it? You don't look like a Pam." She didn't answer. A flicker of something twisted in his stomach, but he didn't stop. "I mean, no offense," he added quickly. "It's just, I don't know. You look more like a Kelly or a Lauren." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Pam sounds like someone's mom." Still nothing. Nathan shifted again. She wasn't just ignoring him now. She was letting him embarrass himself. Across the aisle, the older gentleman had returned to his paper, but Nathan had caught the way he had glanced up at him earlier, judging. 2 rows ahead, a younger man, in a business suit pretended to type on his laptop, but Nathan knew better. He was listening. Even the flight attendant passing by with a tray kept an eye on him out of the corner of her gaze. The realization made Nathan's stomach tighten. They weren't laughing with him. Nathan exhaled sharply through his nose and leaned back in his seat. Fine, let them judge. People were always so uptight these days, acting like a little light-hearted teasing was some kind of personal attack. He hadn't said anything that bad. He drained the last of his scotch, slamming the glass down a little harder than necessary. And then, just as if the universe had been waiting for the perfect moment, the flight attendant spoke. "Ms. Bondi, would you like another beverage?" At first, Nathan barely heard the words. It wasn't until the blonde woman, Pam, looked up, politely declined, and the attendant moved on that his brain caught up. Bondi. Pam Bondi? His whole body tensed. Fingers curling slightly on the armrest, realization hit him like a freight train. Pam Bondi, the former Attorney General of Florida, a woman who had been at the center of some of the most politically charged cases in the country, nationally known, politically connected, a legal bulldog who could go toe-to-toe with the biggest players and win. But more than that, she was the kind of woman who could ruin a person's life with a single phone call. Nathan's throat went dry. He stole another glance at her, but she wasn't looking at him. She didn't need to. She already knew. And now, so did he. For the first time in the entire flight, Nathan had nothing to say. His mind raced, scrambling for an escape, but it was too late. Pam Bondi. The name echoed in his head, unraveling his confidence with every syllable. His fingers tightened around the armrest. How had he not recognized her sooner? Of course he'd seen her before, on news broadcasts, at press conferences, in courtroom footage that had aired on every major network. He had watched her take on corporations, tangle with politicians, and win. And now, he was sitting a few feet away from her, realizing that all the smug, half-whispered remarks he'd made had landed in the absolute worst place possible. The blood drained from his face as he glanced around the cabin, suddenly hyper-aware of how many people had been within earshot. The older gentleman across the aisle, the business traveler typing on his laptop, the flight attendant who had heard everything. Had he just mocked a former attorney general in front of the entire first-class cabin? Nathan cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "I have to fix this." He turned his head slightly, toward her, plastering on a smile that felt like it might crack at any moment. I thought you looked familiar," he said, forcing a light chuckle. "Didn't realize I was in the presence of Florida royalty." Pam didn't react. She didn't turn. She didn't speak. She just continued reading her tablet, as if he were nothing more than background noise. Nathan's stomach twisted. She had heard every word. She had registered every comment. And she had decided he wasn't worth the effort. That was worse than if she had called him out. Much worse. If she had turned and fired back, at least he could have argued. Could have played it off, made a joke out of it, but this was deliberate. She had made a choice to let him drown in his own embarrassment. Nathan shifted again, pretending to adjust his seatbelt as he desperately searched for something, anything, to say to smooth things over. I actually followed some of your cases back in the day," he tried, keeping his tone light. "You've had quite the career." Nothing. No glance. No acknowledgement. Nathan's skin prickled. He exhaled, rubbing his jaw, suddenly aware of how much longer this flight still had to go. It was one thing to be embarrassed for a few minutes. It was another to be trapped at 35,000 feet with no escape, sitting in the tension he had created. And just when he thought it couldn't get any worse, the flight attendant returned. "Another drink, sir?" she asked. Nathan opened his mouth, then hesitated. He wasn't sure why, but suddenly, the idea of another scotch didn't sit right. "Just water," he muttered. The flight attendant nodded, taking his empty glass. And that's when he noticed it. The tiniest flicker of amusement in Pam Bondi's eyes. She hadn't turned her head, hadn't spoken. But in that split second, he knew. She had been watching, she had been waiting. and now she was enjoying every second of his discomfort. For the first time in a long time, Nathan Kessler understood exactly how it felt to be small. Nathan sat rigidly in his seat, the weight of his own words pressing down on him like an anvil. How had he let this happen? He was usually good at reading people, at controlling conversations, at making sure he never ended up looking like the fool. But here he was, trapped in his own arrogance. Nathan stared at the back of a woman's head, a woman who had dismantled him without saying a single word. His mind scrambled, desperate for an exit strategy. Should he apologize? Make a joke? Pretend none of it had happened? He glanced around at the other passengers, subtly gauging the damage. The businessman across the aisle wasn't looking at him anymore, but the slight smirk on his lips told Nathan he had been watching all along. The flight attendant, more professional about it, offered him a neutral glance as she set down his water. "Thanks," Nathan muttered, clearing his throat. She nodded and moved on, and somehow that was worse. Because she didn't pity him. She didn't care. He wasn't important enough to care about. Nathan shifted his gaze back to Pam, who was still reading, still unfazed, still carrying herself like someone who had already moved on. Maybe that's what made it hurt the most. She wasn't angry. She wasn't waiting for an apology. She had simply decided he wasn't worth a second thought. Nathan hated that feeling, and it was his own fault. His fingers tapped restlessly against the tray table, agitation rising inside him. He thought about the stories he'd read about her legal battles, her high-profile cases, the people who had tried to intimidate her and failed. And he, like an idiot, had thought she would care about his opinion. He exhaled slowly. Maybe it was the altitude. Maybe it was the fact that he had nowhere to go. But for the first time in a long time, he started thinking about what kind of person he had become. He had spent years walking into rooms like he owned them, speaking like his words carried more weight than anyone else's, assuming his version of reality was the only one that mattered. But here, in this moment, he wasn't the powerful one. He wasn't the one with control, and he didn't like how that felt. The plane hummed softly around him. The cabin settled into quiet conversation, with the occasional clink of glasses. Nathan picked up his water and took a sip, staring blankly at the seat in front of him. Maybe this was the kind of lesson people like him didn't learn until they had no choice. Maybe this was exactly what he deserved. Nathan stared out the window, watching the sky stretch endlessly beyond the wing. The vastness of it, suddenly, made him feel small, insignificant. It was a foreign feeling, one he wasn't sure he liked. For years, he had carried himself like the center of the universe. People laughed at his jokes, even when they weren't funny. They nodded along when he spoke, even when he had nothing of value to say. He was used to commanding attention, but today, he had been reminded of something he had long forgotten. Respect wasn't about money. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about character. Pam Bondi had done nothing to put him in his place because she didn't have to. She had let his own arrogance do the job for her. Nathan took another sip of water, feeling the coolness settle in his throat. It wasn't scotch, but maybe that was for the best. For once, he needed to sit with his thoughts without drowning them in alcohol. He glanced at her again, half expecting her to finally turn, to throw him a glance of satisfaction. But she didn't. She was done with him. She had been done with him the moment she realized what kind of man he was. That realization twisted in his chest. It wasn't often that someone like him had to face himself, had to sit in the discomfort of knowing he had been the fool in the room. Nathan sighed, rubbing his temple. Maybe it was time he started listening more and talking less. Maybe it was time he started thinking before assuming he knew everything. The flight attendant passed by again, and for the first time Nathan didn't wave her down for another drink. Instead, he sat quietly, watching the sky as the plane began its descent into Tampa. He realized something. This wasn't about Pam Bondi. This was about the kind of man he wanted to be moving forward. How often do we judge people before we even know who they are? How many times have we let arrogance blind us to the truth? Maybe the real lesson here isn't about power or status. Maybe it's about learning to treat people with respect before we regret it. If this story made you think, hit that subscribe button. Who knows? Maybe next time you'll catch yourself before making the same mistake.